There's now a way to contact the Wolf Connection podcast. Send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Calfa. Let's talk about some wolves. The Wolf Connection podcast has a special announcement. Our friends from the band Lost Walks have 2 live shows coming up on March 18th and 19th for the release of the next chapter in their rock opera series, Blood Lantern. If you're going to be in the Denver area, go to lostwalksband.com to purchase your seated or standing tickets for both shows at LFX Filmworks, located at 1701 31st Street in Denver, Colorado. Tickets start from $15 a piece with seated tickets, including 1 free Ratio beer or Dream Apothecary drink. The show is presented by Ratio Beer Works, Indie 102.3, and Drum Apothecary. Support these wonderful humans as they raise awareness, empathy, and action towards protecting wolves and help in the effort to return them to Colorado. Enjoy the show. So after we interviewed one of our other guests, we were pointed to our current guest right now, who comes to us from Dolores, Colorado. He's been there for the better part of 4 years. He is a rangeland scientist, a wildlife conservationist, the owner of Shining Horizons Land Management, a research associate with NRCC, which I'll abbreviate it throughout the podcast, but it's Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative, and also an advisor for the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. Matt Barnes, pleasure to meet you, sir. How's everything going in Colorado?
Hi, John. Thanks. Everything's going pretty well here. It's a beautiful, sunny, and actually unseasonably warm day here in southwestern Colorado.
Yeah, it's warm here in California, too. We're a little bit north of Los Angeles, just for your reference, and I think we're in the low 70s, and then the temperature's going to drop about 20 degrees tomorrow. It's too hot for all the wolves here. I want you to give everybody just I want you to give everybody a background on yourself, because we were discussing just before we started, you wear a ton of hats. It really depends, like you said, on the situation of what you're doing and where you're going at any given moment. So how did you get involved in all of these different aspects, and what sort of led you to start ranching and then get into the coexistence lifestyle?
It's a long story, and one that could probably never be repeated again, as is probably the case with most interesting stories. But I would say it started out as being a kid living in suburbia and trying to escape school to go play in the woods. Eventually that turned into getting degrees in wildlife and rangeland science, and then trying to figure out how to apply that and build a career out of it. I also was afflicted with this dream of being a cowboy, like so many young men in our country are. And that actually did happen to come true. Over this probably 12 years ago now, I quit a perfectly good government job as a rangeland conservationist to go run a ranch seasonally. Did that for 3 years in western Colorado. Ran cattle up in the high country, about maybe 400 head or so. I had a blast doing that for a few years. But while I was doing that, I had a realization one day, which was when, and to give you a little bit of background on that, I wasn't having any conflicts with potential predators there. But there was a coyote den right in the middle of my best pasture. And the cattle, because of the way we were managing them, they learned that they could mob up and run off those coyotes. And in fact, then they also learned that they could run off the ranch dog. And I couldn't bring the ranch dog around them anymore because they started to have this really defensive behavior. And that was interesting that they learned how to do that. Basically, they learned to function like one huge meta-organism, if you will. And I realized that there were things we were doing for management reasons that had nothing to do with predators that sort of facilitated that, or at least probably did. And we were just better able to coexist with coyotes and black bears than maybe some of our neighbors were. And I just became increasingly fascinated with that and thought, there are possible synergies for raising livestock in places that have, seriously potential predators like wolves or grizzly bears that we just haven't really realized the power of yet. And that inspired me to move to Montana and work in a place that did have wolves and grizzly bears. So I did that for several years, worked with ranchers up there, collaborative conservation type projects where mostly I helped them figure out somewhat on their own how they might make changes to make their herds less vulnerable. And I just worked with whoever was willing to try new things. And most of the folks that I worked with did end up having very few conflicts. Not all, but for the most part. So, it's I guess that's the short story anyway. And then, to finish that off, a few years ago, I moved back to Colorado. So now I'm back in Colorado, and it just turns out that coincided with Colorado's Proposition 114, which mandated the restoration of wolves here in Colorado.
Speaking of this history of ranching that you have, I'm reading this. We printed out a High Country Outsider article. It calls the ranch that you had a holistically managed custom cattle grazing operation. Explain to us what that means.
All right. Yeah. So custom grazing, that just means that you run somebody else's cattle. So, and that's a common way that ranches are managed here in the mountains of Western Colorado. It really doesn't pencil out to feed cattle through the winter in a lot of this country. And so a different way to do it is to bring on someone else's cattle for the half of the year or so that Western Colorado is kind of like paradise in the summer, and it's very cold and snowy in the winter. So, so to avoid having to manage cattle through that cold, snowy time, we essentially harvest the grass in a much shorter period of the year by having a custom grazing operation. So, and there's other advantages to that too, which such things as you can be a lot more flexible in how many cattle you have. You can vary the numbers a lot from year to year. You can shorten the season if it's a drought. All kinds of things like that make it easier to match the forage availability in it at any given time. So, and then by holistically managed, that means that we use a framework called holistic management, which is very difficult for me to explain in a short time frame, but there's been books written about it. The idea is it's essentially using things like complexity theory to come up with a way to manage adaptively on the ground. So planning your grazing based on all the things that you think could possibly affect how your grazing might evolve over a season, but then managing it adaptively. So not sticking to a specific grazing rotation, but moving animals around the landscape in a way that makes sense over a period of time and adapting to changes as they occur.
Can you, in just a little bit more detail, can you just speak to the cow herd behavior and what made them less vulnerable than the average cow herd?
Yeah. So we had our animals together in one large herd in a relatively small area, so they couldn't spread out. And that's not to say that they didn't have enough room or anything like that. They had plenty of room, but they wouldn't be scattered over a large landscape at any one time. So if a predator were to appear, the entire herd would know about it in short order. And they figured out that as a herd, they could mob up and run off a potential predator in a way that scattered individuals couldn't. So, and that's not unique to this particular ranch. I think other ranches have seen similar things. I know that other ranches have seen similar things. And that's actually been documented quite a bit in the wildlife ecology literature, but not so much in the ranching world. And so, so my sort of big idea was, well, hey, if we can figure out how to use grazing management, where we keep animals in a single herd and then move that herd around the landscape as opposed to just scatter them out over the course of a season, can we use that as a way to maximize their innate anti-predator behavior? And can we also do that maybe with fewer fences and more herding? My experience is yes, we can. It's not as easy as it sounds, but it is doable. And the thing about herding, the important thing to understand is it's got to be low stress herding. If the experience of being herded by people is a negative one for the animals, it won't work. So, and that is a very esoteric art that I probably am not the one to try to explain the details of it, unless I have a lot of time to think about it.
Copy that. So what did you take from your educational background in wildlife conservation that you have been able to adapt over the course of your careers to really adapt these new ways that these herds are able to act, and the way you're able to have like an ecological system work for these herds, and then ultimately trying to teach other ranchers and other individuals how to use these things positively?
Yeah, gosh. Well, I think my education hasn't ended yet. It's a hard question. I think I don't really draw hard lines between what I've learned in the sciencey sense or the formal education sense and the on the ground sense. I think the trick is figuring out how to constantly integrate all the different ways that we learn as human beings. And so for me, I'm always looking for things that make sense on the ground and from a science point of view. And to me, if something doesn't seem right in one way or the other, it's probably not quite completely right, and there's something else we need to know about it. Mm-hmm. And so, but the interesting thing to me is like that experience I had on that ranch, it turns out that there's actually a lot of science information that says essentially the same thing, but it's mostly dealing with other animals besides domesticated ones. So we see a very similar thing with bison, for example. It's commonly thought of, well, rotational grazing as we practice it with livestock is intended to mirror what we see with bison, or at least what we think we saw with bison historically. And that's probably true, but there's a little bit more to it than that, which is actually, it wasn't just that the bison did that completely by themselves. They did that because they had pressure from their native predators on the Great Plains, which would be wolves and grizzly bears. And that some of those patterns we see on the landscape, the formation of a tight herd of animals that moves over large distances and might graze intensively in any one spot and then come back there after some time period, and hopefully the forage resources recovering in between grazing events. That kind of pattern that we try to create intentionally with rotational grazing on a ranch is really based on the pattern that we see with wild herds and their native predators, with the predators moving them around that landscape over time, combined with other things like if a large herd is in an area, they'll consume the forage resource pretty quickly. They'll also foul it with their own urine and dung so that then they don't want to continue eating it. So that kind of forces them to move on. And then, of course, it takes some time for the grass to grow back. And from a ranching standpoint, the secret is figuring out, well, how much time does it need? So you got to have some rest and recovery before you have another grazing period. So anyway, there's a lot of science related to that. And it's, in practice, I think it's as much an art as it is a science.
Yeah. So from a ranching perspective and in your experience as a rancher, but I'm sure you've also met dozens and dozens of other ranchers and they've shared their experiences with you. What are your thoughts about why domesticated herds kind of unlearn this natural herd dynamic behavior that their wild ancestors still possess? Is it solely because they're not being introduced to apex predators, and especially apex predators that are in a pack? I think probably if I was a cow, that would be a totally different beast. Or do you feel like there's other elements that, particularly anything that maybe is brought on by their interaction with humans?
That is a great question, Stephen, and a very big one, actually. So I think there are several interrelated reasons. So yeah, most cattle in North America today are not facing major predators on any regular basis. So they're not really needing those behaviors. Actually, the predator that cattle and sheep face on a daily basis is humans. And some of that is because humans behave like predators in a largely subconscious way. So the way that we handle our animals as cowboys or sheep herders tends to inadvertently punish them for doing the right thing. So we get them together in a big group,
Right.
and then we do something to them that they don't like. We get them together in a big group, and then we push them someplace. And if we never release the pressure, they never learn that being in that herd is a good thing for them. So, and it's not just that we have to do things like, for example, branding in a corral. There's no way to make that a positive experience. And that's not necessarily what I mean. More importantly, when we just push animals from one place to another, we're never releasing the pressure. But when you release the pressure, that's when they realize that, hey, whatever we just did made the person let up on us. So that was good. And so you got to figure out how to set up a situation to work out that way. So, or another way to put it would be, how do you set up a situation so that they feel like it was their idea when they went to the place that you wanted them to go? And so again, this is very esoteric. It's very much an art form, and it's think of this as more of an art than a science, but there is some science related to it. And the important thing is, so when they do the right thing, you want to release the pressure. Even if you think it's going to slow it down and take longer, in the long run, it'll probably be faster. And you'll probably be able to accomplish the same job with less manpower. So that's a big part of it. And that's why the whole low stress livestock handling thing is so essential in building a herd that can actually coexist with potential predators, because then they're learning that being together actually does help them avoid the negative experience that they typically associate with the human predator. But now we're talking about a real predator. And so that's important. And it's important to understand that's their natural behavior. We're just trying to rekindle it. So we're trying to stop doing all the things that we subconsciously do that unfortunately tend to train them that doesn't work when it does. So, and then you brought up a couple other things that I think are an important part of that. One is that wolves are a different kind of predator than most of the other North American predators, at least the ones that are still around today. So as a coursing predator, that's very different from an ambush predator. So by contrast to a wolf, a cougar is essentially an ambush predator. So they'll wait until they have the situation perfect to just take one prey animal at a time. And they won't attack until they're pretty sure they're going to be successful. So most cougar attempts to kill something probably are successful, but they also pass up a lot of opportunities. And that entire herd of livestock might not even know that one of them had just gotten killed by a cougar, for example. But with wolves, it's a very different story. So as I'm sure you guys know, wolves will get a herd on the move and they'll test them. And it's kind of almost like a war of attrition. And so that they're trying to figure out which ones are going to be easy to kill. And we don't always know what that looks like to a wolf. We're not sure exactly what they see, but we can make some educated guesses. And they do tend to kill animals that are, for whatever reason, are slower or weaker than others. But they do it by getting them on the run. And whichever the weak ones are, they tend to sort themselves out, and the wolves can see that and they can figure it out. I think they can see a lot more than we can, for example. But like in Yellowstone National Park, the data that they've collected there over many years now suggests that wolves are mostly killing either young calves or older cow elk. But mostly not, for example, animals that are in their reproductive prime. Whereas for human hunters, mostly do kill animals that are in their reproductive prime. So different ways of hunting, targeting different sectors of the potential prey population. And I think it has a different effect on that herd of prey animals. So I don't know if I answered your question completely or not, but.
Oh, yeah. Plenty.
So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Was that the goal? Did you initially go to Montana, Wyoming? And I believe this was with People in Carnivores, right? That was the company or whatever it was that you worked in there. Was that your goal after seeing these initial reactions of the mobbing of the herd, that they figured this out, was to try and bring these practices to, like you said, whoever was willing to listen or to learn? Did you find that was people were willing to engage in these techniques and at least give it a shot to try and learn? And was it more positive or negative in your opinion as to what you saw over those, I believe, what do you say, 3 or 4 years that you were in Montana and Wyoming?
Yeah, that's right. I actually, if I have a claim to fame, maybe it's that as a person who was managing a ranch, I actually left a ranch in a place that didn't have wolves and grizzly bears so I could go to a place that did have wolves and grizzly bears. I don't know how many people can say that.
I support it.
Yeah. So, and I went and I worked with People in Carnivores, which is a small nonprofit based in southwestern Montana that largely works on grizzly bear and wolf issues and helps people try to figure out how to coexist with them. And my approach was always to try to find people who are already interested in this sort of thing and willing to try something out of the box rather than try to reach everybody all at the same time. And I guess my thinking on that is, well, in the ranching world, there's a common idea based on innovation adoption theory that, most people are not going to get excited about new things. And in fact, this seems to be especially true in the ranching world. Is for a variety of reasons, ranching sector tends to be really quite conservative, not just in the political sense, but in a more general sense. And I think it's just when you're in a business where you're kind of constantly between a rock and a hard place, that actually does not encourage people to be very innovative. It actually ends up doing the opposite, unfortunately. But in any case, whether we're talking about the ranching community or any other kind of community, a very small portion of people are going to be innovators or early adopters of a new idea. And most people are going to need to see other people who they can relate to be successful at doing something before they'll try it themselves. And then there will be some people who are just very slow to adopt anything new whatsoever. And so knowing that, to me, when you have an idea that you just know people are going to have a lot of resistance to, because many people have already bought into this idea that, oh, we can't coexist, it's impossible, for a variety of reasons, and it turns out that, of course, we can coexist, but there's work to it. It's not easy. So yeah, we might have to do some things differently. But yeah, we can coexist. And so my thinking was, well, if I could find people who've already decided that they want to be able to coexist with wolves and grizzly bears, I want to find those people and help them be successful. And then maybe other people will see that and be like, well, hey, if they can do it, I could do it. Rather than say, hey, I'm this sort of outside expert and you should just listen to me because I know what I'm talking about. That never works. And of course, right. Sometimes I find myself trying it anyway, but I try not to do that.
One of the things we have here to talk about is low stress livestock handling. You definitely mentioned that a few times, but if we can get into just a little bit more detail on that. If let's say you're teaching a class on low stress livestock handling, what does that course look like? What topics are you trying to cover to make sure that a ranch is now participating in low stress livestock handling? What does that mean?
Yeah, great question. And first, I should be honest and say that I'm probably not qualified to teach it yet. I've been trying to learn this stuff for quite a few years, and I'm still learning it. But I've seen enough of it and done enough of it that I can tell that it really does work. But if you go to a good course on it, the first thing to learn is what is it and why is it different from conventional livestock handling? What really makes it different? And then how do you apply that to certain situations, and what are the potential benefits, of which there's many. And most of the potential benefits of low stress livestock handling have nothing to do with predators per se. So, I mean, it's better financially. One of the ranchers I worked with figured out that he probably saved $12,000 just by preventing shrink on his cattle on shipping day because they were handled so calmly. So there are lots of reasons to do it. Animal health is better. Animal welfare is better. That all that for the rancher should translate into making more money. So there's lots of reasons to do it. But the core thing to me about low stress livestock handling is learning how to work with animals on a psychological level. So, and part of that is not behaving like a predator yourself. And a lot of the things we do intuitively are sort of predatorial, at least from the perspective of the animals that we're working with. So some of this is just unlearning things that we think are normal. But the important, and it's not necessarily about being slower and, well, it usually is quieter. It should be quieter than what most people think of as normal. But it's not necessarily slower. And in fact, the people who are good at it will put a lot of pressure on animals, but then they'll also relieve it very quickly as soon as they get the result they want from those animals. So there definitely is pressure put on the animals. The trick is to be able to get the result you want and then remove that pressure right away, so that the animals are, in their own mind, they're probably thinking that they have the ability to release the pressure themselves by doing the right thing. And they don't know that necessarily that there's something you specifically want them to do. They think, hey, I'm going to go over there, and oh, he stopped the pressure when I went over there. And they may never know that I actually wanted them to go there. But it's stuff like that, and it's all done through body language, especially position related to the animals, and the releasing the pressure as soon as they do the right thing. And that's kind of the secret. A couple of other ways of describing it are maybe learning to work animals from the front or the side as opposed to pushing them from the back. Not that there's something wrong with pushing them from the back, but the tendency that most of us have, if we're not really careful, is that we keep pushing them and stop we don't release the pressure. So that's part of it. It's also been described as making the right thing easy and the wrong thing difficult. And so lots of things that go into it. Another one's always making straight lines and sharp angles instead of curved lines. And most of the time we'll tend to make curved lines as we're walking or riding along with a herd of livestock. We don't even realize we're doing it, but they seem to recognize that as the kind of movement that a predator makes. And I can't show you science that proves that this is what cattle are thinking, of course, but based on a lot of experience with people who really know what they're doing, there's a lot of reason to believe that is what they're thinking.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah, it's just one of those tools out there that it's not well understood yet. And part of the reason it's not is that a lot of people think they're doing it when they aren't really. And that's probably the biggest single obstacle to seeing low stress livestock handling much more widely adopted in the ranching world, is that so many people think they're already doing it because they don't really understand what's different about it from conventional handling.
Right.
And to get over that hump really requires some kind of training with somebody who really is an expert in it and really seeing the difference. Otherwise, everybody thinks, well, yeah, the way I handle my animals is low stress, but that's in part because we have a hard time seeing the stress that we put on animals.
Right.
Wow.
I see it all the time with horses too. Even I mean, and they're not necessarily treated exactly like cattle, but I have one horse, and my lady is an avid rider. For some reason, those types of animals, your relationship with them can be so nuanced, and you think you're doing the right thing, and then all of a sudden, something comes up, and you're like, wow, I was not even thinking about that. It can be so subtle. So I can see why you have to have just years of experience, and that cultivates the awareness that lets you see that you're actually fulfilling the duty of whatever a low stress, rancher is supposed to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I've had similar experiences where I thought I was doing something low stress, and later I figured out that I wasn't. But I just couldn't see it at the time. And you're right too, that there's a lot of parallels with natural horsemanship. But the good news is natural horsemanship has become the way that people interact with horses now. Obviously, it's not all done perfectly well all the time, but the old way of breaking horses is now viewed as almost medieval compared to natural horsemanship. And so I hope we get there with low stress livestock handling one of these days.
Yeah. It seems like we have to shift our focus and shift like you said, the way that we used to do things. And I don't know if it's a softer approach, but it's definitely different than I think what it was prior to certainly what you are starting to integrate and what the ranching community is starting to integrate. It seems when you moved back to Colorado, Matt, were you, and you started getting involved with all these other organizations with NRCC and the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project and all that, was your intention to bring all this new knowledge that you had gained and that obviously you're still learning with the ranching community and learning about livestock? And obviously you kind of hit the jackpot in a way that you moved back to Colorado and they passed this law that they're going to reintroduce wolves. Are you bringing all this to Colorado and really showing them what you've learned? Because in that article in the High Country Outsider, you were at the symposium and you were really sharing what you're doing with us now as your experiences and your stories, and not necessarily going one way or the other about the wolf situation, but more just saying, look, this is what I've experienced and these are the tools that I can bring to the table. Was that sort of your game?
Yeah, that's more or less right. So I think I moved back to Colorado between 2017 and 18. And it turned out that there was an effort underway to bring about the reintroduction of wolves to Colorado that had already started. And I thought, well, I'd like to move back to Colorado. Thinking about doing that anyway. And I think I have a lot to offer to this conversation. And I personally do want to see wolves back in Colorado. I hope we can do that in a way that is as fair as possible to the folks who will mostly be living with them. Yeah, I've always seen my role as kind of bringing some knowledge and experience from the Northern Rockies and bringing a science background and trying to dispel some of the myths that always come along with wolves. And so, for example, during the campaign, I did write articles, but I always, I should say, I never told anybody how to vote on Prop 114, for example. Now, of course, if you read what I wrote, you would think, well, yeah, this guy's probably going to vote yes. But I tried not to tell people like, oh, you should vote yes. It's more like, well, it was more about trying to bring a little bit of an enlightened perspective, I guess.
What you mentioned the word we do it fairly. What would it look like what would it look like in your mind if it were done right? Paint a picture of that. What does it mean to do it in a way that is fair for and we mentioned this last time, which is like it's just kind of a truth, is that in a lot of cases the wolves are going to end up on people's properties that maybe it's not that they don't want them there, but they definitely want them there less than the majority of the people in Denver, for example, who are voting for it. So that's just a kind of an unfortunate truth of the matter, is that the folks living with them maybe the dominant perspective is that they'd rather not see at least an abundance of them. So what does it look like for them to do it right in Colorado?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. And as you said, there's basically no way around the fact that a small portion of people are going to have to bear a disproportionate amount of the cost for everybody else.
Exactly.
That's probably more true with restoration of large carnivores like wolves and grizzly bears than it is with most other environmental issues. But it is something we see with almost everything. So most public land issues have the same core consideration, which is the people that live on or near our public lands are always more interested in things like ranching, mining, hunting, fishing, timber harvest, etc. Whereas, people who are living lives relatively removed from that tend to be much more interested in conservation and so on. And so the question is always, how do you figure out, well, what is a balance? I mean, and we know wolves have a lot of value. There was a study recently up in Washington where they figured out that the value of wolf restoration in that state was something like $250 million, maybe. And you could probably argue that it's similar here in Colorado. Now, it's much easier to put a value on a calf or a sheep than it is to put a value on a wolf or a bear, because so an economist would probably say that all of these are problems of market failure, where essentially markets don't provide an efficient allocation of resources in this regard. And that's common throughout all kinds of natural resources issues. There's really never been any such thing as a free and fair market, for example, in something that's so inherently public, like public lands issues. And so we try to figure out, well, how do we recognize that wolves have a lot of positive value that's distributed over a huge number of people and may not be very important to most of those people, but they also have some negative value that's very important to a few people. And the answer to that is not yet clear. But parts of it we do know, and Prop 114 in Colorado, for example, mandates that Colorado Parks and Wildlife will have a conflict prevention program. It doesn't spell out what that looks like. It just says that it should happen. And similarly, it says that there should be compensation paid to livestock owners who inevitably will lose some animals to wolves. I think it's important to note that statistically, the number of animals that get killed by wolves is actually really low, surprisingly low. So in the northern Rockies, if you add up all the animals that have been confirmed to have been killed by wolves, meaning somebody actually went out and did an investigation and said, yeah, the wolf actually did kill this one. They didn't just find it dead already. You add all those up and divide it by the total number of livestock in the same counties, it works out to something like 1/100th of 1% of all the livestock that are out there are actually getting killed by wolves.
Good grief.
Now, that's an underestimate. Yeah, it's a tiny number, but it is an underestimate. We know,
but it's disproportionate.
Yeah. So we know the real number is more than that.
Targeting somebody.
Yeah, but if you're the one who owns those livestock, it can really feel like they're out to get you, and that's kind of hard to get your mind around if you're not that person. So, in any case, it does happen. Wolves do kill livestock sometimes. Now, to be fair, it's also true in the northern Rockies that wolves that do kill livestock tend to get lethally controlled pretty quickly. And that's part of the reason why that number is so low. So we got to keep that in mind and be honest about it. So in any case, some sort of compensation is also mandated by Prop 114 in Colorado, and most states that have wolves have some sort of a compensation program available to livestock owners. And generally, most people think that it just seems fair. Now, there are some arguments about that, and actually what social scientists has been done on this the social science tends to indicate that compensation doesn't work very well in terms of, so if your goal with the compensation program is to essentially buy tolerance for wolves in rural communities, it usually doesn't really work.
Right.
There are a lot of question marks around this issue. The trouble, though, is that same social science doesn't tell us what does work either. And so there might be reasons for having a compensation program besides trying to buy tolerance. And so I think an ideal compensation program would be one that somehow figures out how to reward people for doing the right thing. I find myself, oddly enough, using the same language I did to describe low-stress livestock handling. But that's important because the fundamental problem with compensation is that it's structured so that it rewards a conflict rather than rewarding coexistence. But what the ultimate result we want is to reward coexistence. And so the secret is, well, how in the world do you do that? And the answer is probably something that hasn't been tried very often, which is some sort of outcome-based compensation where you pay for the result that society actually wants, which is both livestock and wolves or bears alive, as opposed to paying for when those predators do kill livestock. Now, actually, in the greater scheme of things, the best thing is probably to do both. So, yeah, we probably do need to pay full market value for animals that get killed, livestock that get killed, I mean. And we probably should also figure out how to also compensate people for the risk that they face by having those predators on their landscape. So, and a way to do that that has been tried is what people call payment for presence or payment for performance. It's a kind of payment for ecosystem services concept. And the idea is, well, what if we could just pay ranchers for having wolves on their landscape? Pay them for every wolf that survives to the end of the year, for example, whether they're involved in conflict or not. So you try to make the wolves valuable for their own sake, as opposed to just paying when they kill something. And so that's one way to try it. Another way is to incentivize coexistence practices. That hasn't been done very much, although many of those practices are actually subsidized. So either an agency is paying a lot of those costs or an NGO is paying some of those costs. So they're not actually all being borne by livestock producers, although inevitably those are the people who have to ultimately be the end user of those practices. So yeah, they are certainly bearing some of the cost, but just not all of it. And the way that works is different in different states. But in Colorado, we're hoping that we can come up with programs both through state agencies and through NGOs that support those kind of practices so that we can hopefully minimize the cost to the livestock owners to actually implement those practices.
You were mentioning the, certainly underestimated number of cattle that die from wolf predation because they have to be confirmed, I assume, by some amount of detailed research. So it's probably a little bit more than that. But if wolves aren't killing that many cattle, what does kill American cattle?
Well, good question. Cattle die of all kinds of things. In the Northern Rockies where I worked, it seemed to be health issues like pneumonia probably was the tops. And larkspur poisoning was another big one. And of course, animals that are, that die of other things get scavenged all the time. And so the fact that there's wolf tracks or bear tracks on a carcass really doesn't mean anything. And in the Northern Rockies, if an animal dies, it will have a wolf or a bear on it within 24 hours, almost everywhere in the Northern Rockies now. So just because you see a wolf on a dead calf doesn't mean the wolf killed it. So there does have to be a field investigation that involves skinning the carcass, looking for subdural hemorrhaging, that kind of thing. The signs that people who study this kind of thing know are associated with certain types of predators. And so they can figure out if it was a predator and if so, which predator. And that's important because otherwise people just assume that every dead animal was killed by a predator. And I don't know why, but there's something about us humans that when our livestock die, our first thought usually is, oh, a wolf or a bear or a cougar or something killed it. When in reality, it was most of the time it was probably pneumonia, a poisonous plant, or some other thing.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, or in Colorado, high altitude pulmonary disease, also known as brisket disease, that kills a lot of cattle, probably more than we realize. And all of these things, of course, they also weaken cattle, so make them more vulnerable to predation while they're still alive. That's part of the equation too. And we don't have solid numbers for how often that happens, but we know that it does happen. Yeah. So as far as those numbers from the Northern Rockies, the number of confirmed kills is it's definitely not all of the kills. It's probably less than half of them. So the real number is probably 2, 3, 4 times as many, but it's not as many as some people would have you believe.
So what are the tools that you're using to break the myth legend cycle that goes into this behavior or these emotions that come out of people that, like you say, they automatically associate a dead livestock, whether it be sheep or goat or cow or cattle, immediately associate with a predator? And is that what when you're talking about before, prior to Stephen's last question about the collaborative conservation aspect of it, is that we're trying to breed this relationship of, encouraging the ecosystem to work naturally with all these apex predators and these livestock as well. So it all can be a collaborative effort as opposed to, like you said, just paying for the negative turn that happens. If my cattle gets killed and we know it's by a predator, here's some money for that. What are the tools that you use to try and dissuade people from understanding that it's not always an apex predator that does these things?
John, that is a great question, and I don't know if I have a great answer for you. Of course, we always need to promote good science and more awareness of what the scientific data tell us about all kinds of things, including why animals die. But it's really hard for some reason to overcome the perception that anything, particularly anything we like that died, probably was killed by something. And I'm not really sure why that is. But I do think that the more we engage in these sort of collaborative conservation efforts, the more likely we are to arrive at better results, including better understanding. And that works both ways. I mean, it's important for livestock owners to realize that livestock die of all kinds of things. It's also important for wolf advocates to realize that sometimes wolves do kill cattle. And, it doesn't benefit any of us when that's happening. It doesn't benefit wolves collectively in the long run either. So it is important that we're responsive to those concerns. But to me, the important thing is having a rational response. So, for example, I don't like lethal control of wolves, but I know it's part of why those numbers are so low in the Northern Rockies. And I know it's going to be part of the program in Colorado inevitably. I just want to see it be not the first arrow in the quiver, but preferably the last. Of course, that also depends on how many arrows are in the quiver.
Also true.
Yeah. And so I think issues surrounding all predators, but I think particularly wolves are really emotional for everyone involved, whether you love them or hate them. There's reasons why we love them or hate them. Some of those reasons are based in fact, and some of those are mostly just in our own minds. But if we can sort of understand that and try to get our minds around why we feel the way we do, I think then it is maybe a little bit easier to sort out what is what's really true from what we just instinctively want to believe is true. And that's always the hard part. But I think it's important that we recognize how our perspectives influence our thinking versus the other way around. So, and for example, one thing that's always intrigued me in Montana, grizzly bears, for example, are demonstrably more of a risk to people and livestock than wolves are. And yet in Montana, grizzly bears are part of the culture, and most people on some level really like them. Some people will say, oh, there's too many or something like that, but not very many people actually hate grizzly bears. But there is an irrational hatred of wolves that you find. And I think there are a couple of explanations for it. One is, well, maybe what people are really upset about is the amount of power and control held by the federal government and or the environmental community, and the way that they seem to be able to tell us folks in the rural communities how we're going to have to live. There's some truth to that. Of course, these communities are rural and desirable because they're close to public lands that belong to everybody. They're managed by the federal government and influenced by the environmental community. So that's all kind of true. But having said that, the other thing I think that maybe influences that is there's no such thing as domesticated bears, but we do have dogs. And I think our relationships with dogs are probably very predictive of how we feel about wolves, or any other large animal like that. And I can't point you to any science about this, although I'd be surprised if nobody's ever studied it in any kind of social science sense. But you know, I mean, to me, it all comes down to how people feel about wildness and domesticity. And, you know, we're all familiar with dogs, and wolves are very bad dogs, which is why some of us love them.
So this is my last question, then I'll pass it over to John. But take us to the Colorado Symposium. Who was there? How did you feel about the overall experience? What did it tell you about where Colorado might be headed in the context of this reintroduction?
Yeah. So I think the symposium you're talking about was one we held in Durango a couple of years ago now. In fact, it was before wolf reintroduction ended up on the ballot, although I think the process had certainly already started by then. But I don't think the ballot initiative itself was in full sway yet, although maybe I'm not sure if it was or not. In any case, it was before the election was held. So, and that was an attempt to bring together a whole bunch of perspectives in one place, and perspectives mostly of people who had lived or worked with wolves in one way or another in other places. So from the Northern Rockies, so some of those folks were ranchers. Most of them were either agency professionals or conservationists. One had worked with the Nez Perce tribe in Idaho, which was actually largely responsible for wolf restoration in the Idaho part of the Northern Rockies reintroductions back in the 1990s. And then we also were careful to have at least one perspective from a rancher who really didn't want to coexist with wolves here in Colorado, but who was a very thoughtful person and probably a very well-educated and thoughtful manager of livestock in many ways. But what we were not trying to do was have a debate between two sides. So we weren't trying to give equal voices to pro and anti or anything like that. We were essentially trying to put together a whole bunch of different perspectives and let people draw their own conclusions. And whether that worked or not, I don't really know. But the Durango area seems to be a place where there's a lot of interest in having wolves back. But there's also a lot of interest in maintaining our ranching community. And I think for some reason, folks in the greater Durango area seem to have created this place where this conversation can happen. And most of them really do sincerely want to have both wolves and ranching as part of our future here in Colorado for a long time to come. And I do too. So,
yeah, I love we loved reading that article, and you quoted at the very tail end of that. I know, and Steven's a huge fan of Aldo Leopold. I'll just read that what you said there. That only the mountain has developed a broad enough perspective to listen objectively to that howl. And it's so true and unique is that Colorado really is in this situation. It's similar, but I think different to what happened in Idaho and Montana, in that this was something that sort of had an organic beginning, it seemed. It's been pitched to the public in a different way. And the conversations that you and so many others there in that state are having, it's making the effect, I think, more plausible and more feasible in a way that people can understand that, hey, like you just said before about Durango and the community wanting to accept the fact to have livestock and ranching and wolves on the landscape at the same time. Do you see that percolating more and more as we inch closer towards 2023 and eventually having wolves on the ground?
Colorado is unique for a handful of reasons. And the most obvious one is this is the first time that a state has used direct democracy to mandate reintroduction of an endangered species. That's never been done anywhere else. In fact, of course, most endangered species restoration efforts have been coordinated by the federal government through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Colorado did reintroduce the Canada lynx, though, back in the 1990s. And so that's one of the few examples, particularly of a predatory mammal reintroduced by a state agency. And I think Colorado would like to reintroduce wolverines, which are native to the southern and central Rockies, but haven't been found here for a long time. But the wolf issue is the one that garnered public attention first, I guess. And actually, it's been on the table for a long time. So there were discussions about reintroducing wolves in Colorado at the same time as they were reintroduced in the northern Rockies. But for a variety of reasons, which I'm not entirely familiar with, it ended up not happening. But Colorado's full of mountains and public land and prey species and all that kind of thing. We just don't have but what we don't have in Colorado is anything quite like Greater Yellowstone or Glacier National Park in the Bob Marshall Wilderness area. We do have lots of public land, and we have a lot of smaller wilderness areas. But I think in Colorado, what we're going to find is that most, if not all, wolves here will overlap with private land and livestock, at least part of the year. I don't think we're going to have any true wilderness wolves here. Maybe a few, but if so, they would be the exceptions. So, and for the most part, and this in the Northern Rockies, one thing I realized is that the big wilderness areas are, well, with one large exception in Idaho, are already full of grizzly bears and wolves. So the exception would be the Salmon Selway Bitter Country in Idaho is actually the largest wilderness area and has few or no grizzly bears yet. So that's a little bit of a different subject. But generally speaking, though, the future gains in carnivore conservation are going to be on working landscapes. So it's going to be where they have to interact with people and livestock. And I think in Colorado, that's going to be the case for most, if not all, wolves. And I think the more we can get our head around that at the outset, the better. And it's important to realize too, we're animals too. I think we make a mistake when we get so absolute on what's native and what's not, and we tend to view humans as not native. When we also know humans have been in North America for tens of thousands of years, and humans who can't claim to be Native Americans have now been here for several hundred years. Livestock have been here for several hundred years. They're not going away. And we're animals too. Humans are a keystone species all over this planet in one way or another, for better or worse. I think now the task facing us is to figure out how to be a keystone species in a way that supports native biodiversity instead of detracts from it.
Yeah.
That is very well said. My last question for you, Matt, is when you hear the word wolf, what is the one thing that comes to your mind?
For me, probably wildness. And by wildness, I mean, we'll go back to Aldo Leopold one last time. Leopold was fond of the phrase that actually Thoreau came up with, which was, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." And interestingly, has been misquoted many times as having said wilderness, when in fact he said wildness. And I think what he meant was a little bit broader than what most of us think of when we talk about ideas like wilderness. So I think he meant a wildness that is sort of inherent in all of life, including human life. And I think wolves are so controversial in large part because they represent other deeper ideas that we have in our own minds and our own culture about wildness and living free and all kinds of things. But they're also just animals, and they're just doing their thing. And I think we can make space for that. Aldo Leopold was probably the first to recommend wolf restoration in North America back in the 1940s, not long before he wrote a Sand Colony Almanac. And we're just now catching up to where he was in 1944 or 1949. And I hope we're doing the work that he was on the cusp of 7 decades ago.
You are certainly one of those individuals that are past the cusp and helping in those ways. Matt, just tell everybody where they can access all of the information that you've gone through, promote. Hold on one second. Definitely tell them where people can look for Shining Horizons Land Management, what that's about, and any sort of social media and things of that sort where people can find the information that you are disseminating throughout the world.
Gosh, thanks. Well, it's probably not all in one place, but I do have a Facebook page that's called Shining Horizons Land Management. There's also the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative Facebook page, and the website nrccooperative.org. And there's a lot of information there. I'm one of many research associates working with that organization. And I'm happy to direct people to more information. You can also find papers I've written on ResearchGate or academia.edu. And
That's great. Everybody who's listening to this episode, they will be in the description. I will point you to all that stuff so you guys can take a look at Matt's work. Matt Barnes, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Nice to meet you, and you're welcome back anytime.
You bet, fellas. I hope to meet you in person one of these days.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely. If we're both there in one shot, we'll give you a heads up for sure.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks.
Awesome. All right. Thanks to Matt Barnes. How's to all of you out there, and we'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.